It started with a piece of paper, just a single sheet, taped crookedly to my front door, flapping in the wind like it knew it carried bad news. I remember the moment I saw it. The sun hadn't even risen properly, the air still heavy with that quiet calm before the world wakes up. But the words on that paper shattered everything. HOA violation notice, immediate action required. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. I kept my property clean, paid my dues, followed every ridiculous rule they posted. But as I read further, the tone changed. It wasn't a warning, it was a threat. They claimed my small valley cabin violated community standards. They wanted me gone. And behind that notice was her, the woman everyone called Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She smiled when I asked her about it. That cold, satisfied smile that told me this wasn't about rules. It was personal. From that day, every time I stepped outside, I could feel their eyes. Neighbors whispering, HOA members taking photos, letters piling up, each one colder than the last. But what they didn't know was that they'd picked a fight they couldn't possibly win. Because that cabin they wanted me out of, that cabin sat on land they didn't own. I did. And by the time they realized it, it was already too late. I remember the morning it started. The air in the valley was still heavy with mist, sunlight just breaking over the ridge, painting the roofs gold. It was the kind of quiet morning that makes you think life's finally slowing down, that maybe, just maybe, the world has decided to leave you in peace. But that illusion shattered the moment I saw the paper flapping on my cabin door. It wasn't a delivery notice or a friendly note. It was official, cold, taped there with purpose. Eviction notice, property in violation of HOA regulations. I froze. My heart didn't even race. It just stopped. For a second, my mind couldn't process what I was reading. How do you get evicted from land you own? How do you violate rules that were never yours to follow? The paper trembled in my hand as I read it again, word by word, the way you stare at something impossible just to make sure it's real. They were giving me 10 days to vacate the premises or face legal action. 10 days. From a cabin that sat on my valley, the one I'd bought outright, deed and all. At first, I thought it had to be a clerical mistake. Maybe someone mixed up addresses, maybe some overworked office worker hit the wrong line on a form. But then I saw the signature. Karen M., HOA president. That's when the heat rose in my chest. The kind that's not fear, not panic, but anger. The slow, tightening kind that starts deep in your gut and burns its way up.
Karen had been a name I'd heard whispered since I'd moved here. The kind of person neighbors talk about in hushed tones. The enforcer. The one who made people repaint their mailboxes because they were too reflective. The one who fined an elderly man for planting a tree without written approval. I'd stayed out of it. I lived far enough down the valley that I barely saw anyone. My cabin wasn't even part of their development. My property line was older than the HOA itself, but that didn't stop her. I walked up to the main office that afternoon, papers still crumpled in my hand. The HOA building sat right at the edge of their community, a squat brick structure with manicured shrubs out front and a flagpole that gleamed like it had been polished that morning. The air smelled like fresh paint and control. Inside, Karen was exactly what I expected. Pressed blouse, clipboard in hand, that polite smile that doesn't reach the eyes. When I told her the land was mine, her expression didn't change. She didn't even blink. She just said, "If you believe there's been an error, you can file a dispute in writing. But as of now, you're in violation of HOA regulations regarding unsanctioned occupancy." "Unsanctioned occupancy?" I repeated, my voice barely steady. "I own the land." She tilted her head as if she were explaining something to a child. Our records show this valley falls within the boundaries of Ridgeview Estates. All properties here are subject to HOA guidelines. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. It was a move. A calculated one. Maybe she wanted to expand the HOA's reach. Maybe she just didn't like that someone lived nearby without bowing to her rules. Whatever it was, she wanted me out. I left her office with that same paper still in my hand, now heavier than ever. By the time I got back to my cabin, a neighbor had already stopped by to warn me. He looked nervous, apologetic even, as if he didn't want to get involved but couldn't resist telling me, "Karen doesn't lose. She'll fine you until you give up." That night, I sat on my porch, watching the last light fade across the valley. The wind carried the faint hum of distant traffic, the creak of old trees, and something else. The weight of injustice pressing down. You'd think anger would fade when the sun goes down. It didn't. It settled into my bones, heavy and solid. I pulled out the deed, the legal documents, every paper proving this valley was mine. I ran my finger over the seal, the signatures, the coordinates. I'd worked years for this, saved, sacrificed, built this place from the dirt up. And now someone with a clipboard thought they could just erase that with a notice taped to a door? Not a chance. The next few days were a blur of letters, emails, and calls, all met with the same cold responses. They said they had authority over this land, that their community expansion plan gave them jurisdiction. They even claimed I had violated aesthetic standards by keeping my truck parked outside the cabin. Each message was another slap in the face. Each word, another spark. But somewhere between the frustration and disbelief, something else began to grow. Focus. I realized Karen didn't expect me to fight back. She thought I'd fold like so many others before me. That's what people like her counted on. Silence. Compliance. So I started digging into land records, legal boundaries, old surveys, and the deeper I went, the clearer it became. Not only was I right, but she was way out of line. The HOA's map, drawn years after my deed. Their jurisdiction, it stopped nearly a mile before my property line. I wasn't the intruder here. They were. The day that realization hit me, the anger turned into something sharper. Purpose. I wasn't just defending my home anymore. I was exposing a lie. I didn't confront her right away. No. I waited. I gathered every document, every legal reference, every boundary marker. Because when I did finally walk back into that office, I wanted her to see the truth in ink she couldn't erase. But that's a story for the next part. Because what happened after that? Let's just say the woman who tried to evict me from my own land learned exactly what happens when you push the wrong person too far.
I used to love mornings in the valley. The kind where the fog hangs low over the trees and everything smells like wet earth and pine. My cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, a little sunlit pocket surrounded by evergreens, wildflowers, and the soft hum of the creek behind the hill. It wasn't much. A modest, weathered cabin with a creaky porch and a fireplace that smoked more than it roared, but it was mine. And for someone like me, a freelance writer trying to escape the endless hum of the city, it was perfect. Every day started the same way. I'd make coffee, sit on the porch with the mug warming my hands, and listen to the valley wake up. Birds flitting through the trees, the faint bark of a distant dog, sometimes the rustle of a neighbor's truck pulling out for the day. In those moments, it felt like the world had slowed down just for me. Life here was simple. I spent mornings writing at my little desk by the window, sunlight spilling across my notebooks. Afternoons were for wandering the trails behind my cabin, sketching the landscape, or collecting firewood. I wasn't rich, and I didn't need to be. This place offered something the city never could: space to think, freedom to create, and a silence that let ideas breathe. But even paradise has its cracks. The valley wasn't empty, far from it. On paper, it looked idyllic. Scattered cabins and small houses tucked between trees. Distant neighbors more like occasional silhouettes than daily interruptions. But in reality, the community was small, tightly knit, and unforgiving. and almost everyone bowed to the HOA's rules like they were sacred law. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I had my routines, my work, my valley. Neighbors waved politely when we passed each other on the narrow dirt road, exchanged a few words about weather or wildlife, and that was enough. I thought living here meant peace, quiet, and freedom. That and I started noticing little things. The sideways glances from the mailbox, comments slipped into conversation, "You really should repaint that porch, HOA standards," or "The HOA wouldn't like that shade of green on your shutters." I brushed them off, thinking, okay, small town chatter, nothing serious. But it was. The valley was under the thumb of the HOA. Even if my land wasn't technically part of their original development, they controlled everything. Rules about fence heights, paint colors, landscaping, even parking. Neighbors repeated these rules with almost religious fervor, as if reciting them proved loyalty to some unseen authority, and anyone who didn't comply became a target, talked about behind their backs, suddenly warned to fall in line. For months, I lived in a bubble of quiet denial. I wrote, walked the trails, drank coffee on the porch, and I thought my solitude insulated me. That was until Karen entered the picture. Though back then, I didn't know her name. I only knew the moment she appeared in the neighborhood gossip. Her reputation whispered along the roads like a cautionary tale. She was the enforcer, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Neighbors referred to her with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. She had a knack for finding violations, real or imagined, and punishing them relentlessly. And yet, life remained deceptively calm. Even as Karen's influence stretched across the valley, I managed to avoid her. I kept my cabin, maintained my small garden, and stayed out of the communal disputes. My days unfolded in routine, sunrise walks, notes for my novel, and the occasional trip to the market for a fresh bread or coffee beans. I felt insulated, untouchable in my little world. It wasn't just the peace I loved, it was the sense of control. Out here, I was the architect of my days, the master of my own schedule. No bosses, no city noise, no endless demands. Just the valley, my cabin, and my work. I told myself the HOA didn't concern me. After all, my land was mine, officially, legally, without question. But the valley is a small place, and nothing stays private for long. Neighbors began watching more closely than I realized. At first, it was subtle. Glances when I carried a ladder to fix a roof, a note slipped under my door about the weeds creeping along the property line, hints that my cabin was standing out in ways the HOA might not like. I tried to laugh it off, convinced it was small-town paranoia. Then came the stories. Tales of fines imposed for the tiniest infractions. Neighbors evicted for paint colors deemed unauthorized. A dog owner fined for barking at dawn. The HOA wasn't just strict, it was punitive. It demanded obedience, loyalty, and most of all, silence. Those who questioned it were made examples of. And quietly, fear was spreading among the valley residents. I remember the first moment it hit me that I wasn't entirely safe here. I was writing at my desk, a cold morning breeze drifting through the open window, when I overheard voices outside. Two neighbors, whispering at the edge of my property. "Did you see what she did to the Smiths?" said one. "They didn't even repaint the shutters on time. HOA came down on them hard." I clenched my pen, my heart skipping a beat. That could never be me, I told myself. My cabin was mine. I owned the land. No HOA could touch me. But a sliver of doubt, just a tiny one, crept in. The valley was beautiful, yes, but it was also tightly controlled. Power and fear intertwined in ways I hadn't noticed before. For a time, I tried to ignore it. I wrote my stories, took long walks along the ridge, listened to the creek, and told myself that knowledge was safety. If I stayed invisible, if I kept my life quiet and routine, I could avoid conflict. I was careful, polite, and respectful. I did not provoke, and I assumed that was enough. But even in paradise, trouble has a way of finding those who think they're untouchable. And in the valley, the most dangerous thing was not a neighbor, not even the land itself. It was the illusion of security, that fragile belief that I could live here, undisturbed, under my own rules. Little did I know, my peaceful mornings, my sunlit trails, and my quiet writing desk were about to collide with something I never expected. An authority that didn't recognize my ownership, a person who didn't care about my rights, and a community that whispered loyalty to her with fearful obedience.
It would start with a piece of paper on my door, a notice that changed everything. And when it came, I would realize that the valley, the cabin, and everything I had built for myself, my sanctuary, was about to become the center of a battle I didn't see coming. I thought I understood the valley, its rhythms, its quiet mornings, and its evenings filled with the soft hum of crickets and the distant barking of dogs. But I soon learned that understanding was nothing. Because the valley I loved, the cabin I'd built my life around, was not immune to the reach of people like Karen and the HOA. And once they had their sights on me, the piece I had so carefully carved out vanished like smoke in the wind. The first real sign of trouble came in a letter. Another one. I still remember sitting on my porch, coffee cooling in my hand, the wind shaking the trees behind me when I saw the envelope pinned under the porch railing. The HOA's logo glared at me, bold and official, and I felt that familiar sinking feeling in my stomach. I blinked. I had no idea what they were talking about. I had maintained my cabin meticulously, keeping it clean, painting, repairs, trimming trees. Everything in my life was visible, nothing hidden. But apparently something, anything, could become a violation under Karen's scrutiny. Over the next few days, letters kept arriving, each one more absurd than the last. Fines for unauthorized landscaping modifications, warnings about improper parking arrangements, claims that my cabin's porch wasn't in line with community standards. Each one left me reeling. The sums weren't massive at first, just a few $100s each, but the principle, the sheer audacity of it, gnawed at me. It wasn't just the letters. Neighbors who I thought were indifferent or polite began watching me in ways that made my skin crawl. A truck idling at the edge of the valley for no reason, cameras pointed vaguely in my direction, whispered conversations stopping as soon as I walked past. I realized I was under surveillance, my life dissected piece by piece. I tried talking to Karen once. I wanted to reason with her, to explain that my land was mine, legally documented, beyond the HOA's control. She didn't even listen. I could feel her eyes, cold and calculating, scanning for weakness. She smiled at me, that same smug expression from the first encounter, and said, "Rules are rules. Everyone must comply." Every step I took felt like a minefield. I'd go out to gather firewood and return to find another note on my door. A warning, a fine, a threat. Each one more ridiculous than the last. And yet, there was a method to it. Karen wanted me unsettled, questioning my right to even exist in my own home. She wanted fear. She wanted compliance. One evening, as I sat in my cabin, notebook open, trying to write and failing because my mind kept returning to the letters, a neighbor appeared at my gate. He pretended to be casual, dropping small hints. "Karen has been reviewing property lines lately. You might want to check that your cabin's placement is correct." His tone was friendly, but the message was clear. They were watching. They were scheming. And I began to realize that it wasn't just about aesthetic rules or fines. This was personal. They resented me because I didn't belong to their little club. I didn't obey blindly. I didn't participate in their gossip or their petty competitions. I was independent, and that independence made me a target. Days blurred into weeks. Each morning brought a new letter, each afternoon a fresh whisper from a neighbor, each evening a growing sense of suffocation. I spent hours poring over legal documents, surveys, land deeds. I double-checked every boundary line, every recorded right. I knew I was in the right, but knowing that didn't make the harassment any easier to bear. Then came the threats. Not just warnings anymore. Actual threats. One afternoon, I found a notice taped to my door, a court summons. They claimed I had violated the HOA's occupancy rules and demanded I appear or face legal action. I stared at it, my hands trembling. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about intimidation. They were trying to scare me out of my own home.
I wanted to explode. I wanted to march into that office and demand justice. But I knew patience was my weapon. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every encounter, every whisper from a neighbor. I cataloged fines, recorded conversations, noted dates. Each piece became a brick in a wall of proof I was building, a wall I would one day use to stop them. But Karen wasn't slowing down. If anything, she escalated. She sent inspectors to my property, supposedly to verify compliance. They poked around my cabin, measured my porch, examined my landscaping, and left with blank expressions that said nothing, but felt threatening all the same. One inspector lingered at the property line, asking questions in a tone that implied I didn't belong here. I bit back words I wanted to scream out loud. And the neighbors, they began turning more openly against me. Notes left in my mailbox, friendly hellos replaced by icy stares, whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. It became clear that Karen's influence had infected the valley entirely. I wasn't just fighting her, I was fighting an entire community conditioned to obey her. Late one night, as I sat by the fireplace reviewing yet another fine for unauthorized exterior decor, I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I had ever known. This wasn't just harassment. It wasn't just unfairness. It was a war being waged on me, personally, because I refused to bow. And in that moment, I realized that if I didn't fight, I would lose everything. My home, my sanctuary, my peace. I started planning small acts of defiance. I refused to pay unjust fines immediately. I documented every notice, every inspection, every interaction. I researched the HOA's formation, their boundaries, the legal documents that define my rights. Every discovery fueled my anger, but also my hope. Because the more I learned, the more I realized Karen and her followers had overstepped. They had no legal authority over me. None. And yet, as I prepared to push back, I knew it wouldn't be simple. Karen was clever. She had allies, influence, and patience. She could make life miserable in ways I hadn't even imagined yet. Each morning brought a new anxiety. What new rule would she enforce today? What new neighbor would report me for breathing wrong? Then came the message that froze my blood. One morning, I found a new letter slipped under my door, the HOA seal stamped clearly at the top. It was thicker than the others, heavier, official. I opened it carefully, hands shaking. The words inside made my jaw tighten. Immediate legal action pending. Failure to comply will result in eviction. I read it over and over. Eviction. From land I owned outright. From the cabin that I had built with my own hands. From the valley that I had cherished for years. At that moment, something inside me changed. Fear had its place, but anger had taken root. And that anger wasn't just a reaction. It was a spark, a promise. If they thought I would leave quietly, they were wrong. Very wrong. I stared out at the valley, the trees swaying under the gentle wind, the sun barely rising over the ridge. The peace I had once known seemed like a distant memory. But in its place, a new determination burned. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to cower. They had pushed me too far, threatened my home, and underestimated my resolve. Karen and the HOA had no idea what was coming next, because by the time this was over, they would learn a hard truth. Some people cannot be intimidated. Some people will fight for what is theirs. And I was one of them. And then, the next morning, a knock at my door changed everything again. I opened it to find someone I didn't expect. Someone who claimed they had inside information on the HOA's next moves. Their message hinted at a legal loophole, something that could turn the tables completely. But before I could ask more, they were gone. leaving only a slip of paper and the growing realization that the real battle had only just begun. The valley that had once felt like peace was now a battlefield, and I had no intention of backing down.
I knew the day would come when the valley would no longer feel like mine, not if I didn't act. Every letter, every inspection, every whisper from a neighbor had led to this moment, the point where patience had run out and determination burned hotter than anger. I had the deeds, the surveys, the legal evidence stacked like armor around me. But Karen, with her clipboard and her smug, unyielding expression, had underestimated one thing: me. It started with a knock, a soft, deliberate rap on my cabin door, echoing through the early morning quiet. I wasn't expecting visitors, not from neighbors, not from anyone connected to the HOA. Yet there she was, Karen, standing there like she owned the valley, which, in her mind, she probably did. The clipboard was tucked under her arm, her posture sharp, her eyes cold. "Morning," she said, her tone saccharine, almost innocent. "We need to finalize the inspection. The HOA has reviewed your property, and there are still issues." Issues. Every word from her mouth was meant to undermine me, to remind me that despite my ownership, despite the clear legal facts, she believed she had control. And for a moment, I felt the old twinge of frustration, but it was fleeting. This time, I wasn't just going to respond, I was going to act. I invited her inside, not out of politeness, but to confront her directly, to make her see what she was up against. The cabin smelled of pine and old wood, the sunlight cutting across my desk where notebooks and maps were spread out. Every document, every legal note I had collected sat ready. Evidence of her overreach, her overstepping, her abuse of power. "I'm glad you came," I said, calmly, almost too calm, "because I think it's time we reviewed some facts." Her smile faltered slightly, though she hid it quickly. She didn't expect me to have evidence. She expected me to stumble, to beg, to retreat. I began with the basics. My deed, dated years before the HOA's expansion, official county surveys marking my property lines, photographs proving my cabin's compliance with zoning laws. I laid it out on the table methodically, letting the weight of each piece of evidence speak louder than any words I could muster. She leaned over, scanning the documents quickly, eyes flicking with annoyance. "Those don't change anything. The HOA's jurisdiction." I cut her off. "Actually, they do. According to county records and historical property documents, the HOA's boundaries don't include my land. Your rules don't apply here. You've been overstepping, threatening eviction, and issuing fines without authority. Every notice you sent, every inspection, is invalid." The air thickened. Karen's face hardened, and I could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She was trying to calculate a response, a way to reclaim control, but she hadn't anticipated the thoroughness of my preparation. And then the call came. My attorney, the one I had reached out to in secret days ago. She had reviewed every document, every HOA statute, and she was ready to intervene. I put the phone on speaker. "Ms. Karen, your organization has no legal authority over Mr. Homeowner. All prior notices, fines, and inspections are null and void. Any further attempts at harassment will be considered actionable." Karen's mouth twitched. I could almost see the disbelief in her eyes. She had built her empire on fear, on the assumption that people would comply without question. I had just removed the fear. But she wasn't finished. Karen tried another tactic: intimidation. "If you continue to resist, we could escalate to county enforcement. Legal costs, fines, even potential lien placements." I held up my hand. "Calm me." Steadily. I had anticipated every threat, every bluff. "Do you really want to test that?"
Because I have all documentation ready. Every survey, every deed, every law. Go ahead. I'll see you in court. And when we do, the HOA will lose. You know it. I know it. The question is, can you handle losing in front of the entire community? Her lips pressed into a thin line. She realized I wasn't bluffing. The air felt charged, heavy, like the valley itself was holding its breath. And then a neighbor stepped forward. One of the very ones who had whispered about me, who had sent warnings, who had nodded at Karen's actions over the past weeks. But this time, they weren't reporting me. They were handing me a stack of documents, unsigned complaints, false violation notices, evidence of HOA overreach, everything Karen had relied on to intimidate residents. The neighbor's eyes met mine, a silent acknowledgement, she's been lying. I laid the new evidence next to mine, each piece stacked against Karen's authority, each page a nail in the coffin of her supposed power. For a moment she faltered. The mask cracked, and then she lashed out verbally, trying to regain control with a sudden barrage of accusations, insults thinly disguised as policy reminders. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting, filling the small cabin with tension. But I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. Every word I spoke was deliberate, measured, pointed, and backed by law. Karen, your intimidation stops here. Every violation notice, every fine, every threat, it's all null. You're exposed, and the valley knows it now. She glared at me, fury barely contained, but there was a tremor beneath the surface. The calm, composed image she projected to neighbors, the image of power, had cracked in front of my cabin. Then the final move. I invited her to read the deeds herself, to check the county maps, to verify every single boundary line. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the moment of reckoning. She had no argument left, no bluff to play, no authority to wield. Outside, the neighbors gathered slowly, drawn by the tension, by the heated voices. The quiet valley that had once whispered compliance now bore witness to a confrontation that could not be ignored. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into exclamations. People began to talk openly about the fines, the threats, the letters, about the overreach, about Karen's control. And there, standing in the doorway of my cabin, evidence in hand, voice steady, I realized that the tide had shifted. The balance of power that Karen had held for months, the fear, the control, the relentless pressure, had finally begun to tip. The valley was no longer a place of silent oppression. It was a stage, and I had claimed it.
But even in that moment of triumph, I knew this wasn't over. Karen was still there, still scowling, still plotting. And while the documents proved my legal right, she had influence, connections, and stubbornness. The real question wasn't whether I was right. The real question was whether she would stop at nothing to reclaim what she thought was hers. And then, a sudden commotion from the edge of the property. A vehicle idling, a figure approaching quickly, letters flapping in the wind. Something was coming. A final push from the HOA or one of her allies. I looked out across the valley, heart pounding, knowing that the battle I had waged, the preparation, the patience, and the evidence, all would be tested in the next few minutes. Because the confrontation wasn't over. Not yet. And the valley, my home, had never felt so alive with tension and possibility. The figure at the edge of the valley moved closer, the engine of the truck rumbling faintly against the quiet morning. My pulse quickened. Every instinct told me something significant was about to happen. I stepped to the porch, squinting into the sunlight that glinted off the windshield, and froze. It was an attorney from the county. Someone my lawyer had called ahead. They were carrying a thick folder, official stamps visible through the clear plastic cover. They had come to serve notice. Not the kind that threatened me, but the kind that validated my rights, undermined Karen, and effectively nullified every overreach she had attempted. Karen's eyes flicked between the folder and me. Her lips pressed into a thin, controlled line. I saw the moment her carefully constructed facade began to crack. For the first time, her confidence faltered. The attorney spoke directly, with authority that made even Karen flinch. Miss Karen, according to county records and property law, the HOA has no jurisdiction over this property. All prior notices, fines, and attempted actions are considered null and void. Any further attempts to harass or intimidate the homeowner will be taken as actionable offenses. The words hung in the valley air, heavy and decisive. I could feel the tension shivering like the wind through the trees. Neighbors, who had gathered cautiously behind the cabin, began murmuring, whispering, and then talking openly. Their fear, cultivated over years, collided with the clarity of the law. Karen's hand tightened around her clipboard. She opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came. The moment that had sustained her control, the illusion of power, had been shattered. Every lie, every threat, every intimidation tactic suddenly seemed petty and small. She was exposed, cornered, and for the first time, visibly human. I stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. You've underestimated what people are willing to fight for. I didn't ask for conflict, I didn't want it, but I will protect my home, my land, and my life. That isn't negotiable. A few of the neighbors stepped closer now, emboldened. One whispered to another, "She can't do anything. He's right. He owns it all." Another added, "Finally, someone stood up to her." Karen's expression twisted, equal parts fury and disbelief. Her usual aura of control was gone. She had no allies here anymore. The community that had once feared her now witnessed her fall from the position she had so meticulously built. Then, as if the valley itself were conspiring with me, my lawyer handed over the documents, official county maps, property deeds, legal notices, and a list of prior attempted violations that were deemed unenforceable. Every paper she had used to threaten, fine, or intimidate me was now a tool to demonstrate her abuse of power. Karen's voice finally broke through, sharp and trembling. This isn't over. The HOA still has rights. You'll see." I met her gaze steadily. "No, Karen, you've already lost. Your power depended on fear, and fear has limits. You miscalculated, and now everyone can see it." The weight of the moment hit me fully. The valley was quiet again, but in a different way. Not the serene calm of mornings past, but a charged electric quiet, heavy with relief, vindication, and the knowledge that justice had been served. The neighbors began speaking freely, sharing stories of their own small fines, threats, and intimidation tactics. Karen's authority crumbled before their eyes. What had seemed invincible, the rules, the fines, the fear, was nothing but paper and bluff. And the more I saw them embrace that reality, the more the anger I had carried transformed into a triumphant satisfaction. But the climax wasn't just legal, it was personal. The months of harassment, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, all of it culminated here, in that small clearing outside my cabin, with Karen's smugness replaced by a rare and unguarded vulnerability. I stepped closer, voice carrying for the gathered neighbors to hear. This isn't just about me. This is about standing up for what's right, for not letting fear dictate your life. If someone comes to your door, threatening your home, your peace, your rights, you have to push back. You have to fight. That's the lesson we've all learned today. Karen's mouth opened again, but the words faltered. Her authority had evaporated. And just like that, the tide had shifted. Where she had once been the enforcer, she was now the outsider. A cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors by those who had once feared her. The final act came subtly. The attorney served one more notice,
formally documenting the HOA's lack of jurisdiction and warning of legal consequences for any future harassment. Karen stared, incredulous, as I signed off on copies and filed them for safety. This time, there would be no surprises, no intimidation, no fines, no threats. I leaned against my porch railing, exhaustion and adrenaline flooding me simultaneously. Months of fear, anxiety, and struggle had led to this moment. The valley, my cabin, my sanctuary, finally secure. And then, as I looked around, I realized the most profound change wasn't legal. It was the atmosphere. Neighbors who had once whispered behind my back now spoke openly, some even apologizing for the fear they had perpetuated. The valley that had seemed hostile and suffocating became in that instant a community reborn, at least in its potential. People had witnessed what standing up could achieve. Fear had been replaced with empowerment. Karen finally turned to leave, her clipboard clutched tightly, head down, dignity diminished. I didn't shout or gloat. I didn't need to. The valley, the documents, the witnesses, they had done the work for me. I watched her go, and a quiet smile spread across my face. The valley was mine again, not just by law, but by principle, by courage, and by refusing to be intimidated. The peace I had cherished was restored, stronger and more resilient than before. Yet as I stepped onto the porch and breathed in the morning air, I couldn't shake a final thought. Battles like this leave marks. Even when you win, the memory of the fight lingers. Karen was gone, for now, but in the quiet moments, I knew vigilance was still necessary. I had claimed victory, but the valley had taught me something crucial. Power can corrupt, fear can control, but courage and persistence can rewrite the rules. And with that knowledge, I felt ready. Ready for whatever came next, knowing that no paper, no letter, and no authority could ever intimidate me from protecting what was mine. The valley had witnessed the clash, and in that witnessing, a promise was made that this home, this life, and this land would never be taken without a fight again. And as the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sounds of the creek, the distant dogs, and the first birds of morning, I realized something profound. This wasn't just a victory. It was a lesson. For me, for the valley, and for anyone who thought that fear could rule where courage had a voice.
The valley felt different the morning after the confrontation. The air itself seemed lighter, as though the trees and the creek had exhaled the tension that had gripped this place for months. I stepped onto my porch with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in what felt like a lifetime. My cabin, my land, my sanctuary. It was finally mine in more than just legal terms. The aftermath of the HOA clash wasn't immediate chaos or celebration. It was subtle, gradual, almost surreal. The neighbors who had whispered and watched and tattled now approached differently. Some offered tentative smiles. Some nodded in acknowledgement, as if they were silently saying, "You did what we couldn't." There was a respect there, the kind that comes from witnessing courage, from seeing someone stand firm in the face of relentless intimidation. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting constantly on what had happened. The confrontation with Karen and the HOA had been intense, exhausting, emotionally draining, but it had also been illuminating. I realized that I had underestimated the depth of human fear, the way it could allow people to comply with unfair authority, to become enforcers themselves without even thinking. But I had also discovered the extraordinary power of standing up. Even one voice, determined, prepared, and unwavering, could disrupt a system built on fear. Life slowly returned to a rhythm that felt familiar, but more meaningful. I resumed my mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, notebook open, listening to the gentle sounds of the valley. Only now there was a sharper clarity in my observation of the land, of the people, of the subtle dynamics that had governed this community. The valley was peaceful again, but the peace was no longer naive. It was earned. Karen never returned to confront me again, directly, at least not in any official capacity.
Her authority had crumbled publicly, and the legal documents I now held made any attempt at further harassment impossible without exposing herself to consequences. I learned later through whispers and cautious conversations that she had retreated into her office, trying to salvage whatever control she could over the remaining properties under her HOA. The woman who once wielded fear like a weapon was revealed for what she truly was, a bully, relying on the silence and compliance of others. And yet, the story didn't end with her alone. The valley, the neighbors, the very fabric of the community had shifted. People began speaking more freely, sharing their own stories of minor fines, petty rules, and intimidation. Some admitted they had been afraid to challenge her, even when they knew she overstepped. Others confessed that witnessing my fight had inspired them to question the authority they had previously obeyed without thought. I realized something powerful. Fear thrives in isolation, but courage spreads when it is seen. I began keeping more meticulous records, not just for myself, but for anyone who might face similar challenges. I documented every interaction, every piece of correspondence, every legal boundary. I created a small repository of knowledge about HOA overreach, property rights, and the ways communities could be manipulated. It became a quiet mission to empower others in the valley, to prevent anyone from enduring what I had gone through alone. The financial fines the HOA had attempted to impose, all dismissed, officially. The county recognized the lack of jurisdiction, and my records showed every violation notice, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. In some ways, the whole ordeal became a case study, not just for me, but for the entire region, on how authority can be misused and how accountability can be enforced. But the personal victories mattered just as much. My mornings were no longer clouded with anxiety or dread. I walked the trails freely, collected firewood without worry, and sat by the creek thinking of stories, ideas, and projects without the constant weight of looming threats. The valley had reclaimed me, but I had also reclaimed myself. I realized the fight wasn't just about property, it had been about dignity, autonomy, and the right to live without fear imposed by someone else. Neighbors gradually began approaching me for advice. They wanted to know how I had navigated the conflict, how I had found the courage and the resources to stand firm. I shared cautiously, not as a boast, but as guidance. I emphasized preparation, documentation, patience, and the willingness to confront injustice with calm but unwavering resolution. The conversations often turned into small community discussions about fairness, transparency, and the importance of questioning authority. In time, I noticed subtle changes in behavior around the valley. People painted their fences without waiting for approvals that were technically irrelevant. They held small meetings to discuss rules openly. They asked questions about property rights without fear of retribution. The HOA's influence had been chipped away, not by brute force or vengeance, but by transparency, courage, and the undeniable weight of legal and moral truth. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun fall behind the ridge, I reflected on the months of conflict. It had been exhausting, emotionally, mentally, and even physically. I had spent countless nights awake, reviewing documents, writing letters, planning responses. I had faced manipulation, lies, and intimidation, but the result was worth every sleepless night. My home was secure, my peace restored, and the valley no longer under the shadow of fear I had once felt. And yet the lessons extended far beyond myself. The conflict had revealed something universal, that power is never absolute, that authority unchecked can become tyranny, and that even ordinary people can push back if they are informed, prepared, and courageous. I realized that my story could inspire others, not just in this valley, but anywhere individuals face intimidation or unfair control.
The community slowly began to heal. Relationships that had been strained under the pressure of fear began to mend. Some neighbors who had once watched silently now offered genuine greetings. Others expressed gratitude for showing that standing firm didn't require confrontation through anger, but through knowledge, strategy, and unwavering commitment to what is right. I also took time to rebuild my cabin in subtle ways, not because it needed repair, but as a symbolic gesture. Every nail, every brushstroke, every small improvement was a reminder of resilience. The land was mine, legally, morally, and spiritually, and I intended to keep it that way. Looking back, I understood that the conflict had been transformative. I hadn't just defended property, I had defended principles. I had defended the idea that no one should be bullied into submission simply because they live outside someone else's arbitrary rules. And the greatest victory wasn't in the documents or the legal letters, it was in the restoration of dignity for myself and for the community. In quiet moments, I reflected on Karen and the HOA. Their ambition, their desire for control had been formidable, but it had its limits. Fear, I realized, only works when it goes unchallenged. Once someone refuses to yield, once someone documents, prepares, and acts strategically, even the most entrenched authority can be undone. Months later, the valley had returned to its rhythm. Mornings filled with mist and sunlight, evenings with the creek's murmur and birdsong. But the valley, and I, had changed. There was awareness now, a cautious vigilance, but also a newfound sense of empowerment. I no longer viewed neighbors or the environment with naive trust or fear. I saw the valley as it truly was, beautiful, resilient, and capable of standing up to injustice. And in the end, the lesson that lingered, the one I would carry forward and share, was this: you may be ordinary, you may be alone, but when you refuse to bow to intimidation, when you arm yourself with knowledge and courage, you become unstoppable. No amount of authority can erase your rights, no amount of fear can silence your conviction, and no bully can take what is truly yours when you fight with integrity. I often share this lesson now with visitors, neighbors, and even online communities. The story of how a simple cabin in a valley became the battleground for fairness, courage, and justice. And while some may focus on the conflict itself, I focus on the aftermath, the empowerment, the awareness, and the peaceful mornings that follow once he refused to be ruled by fear. The valley, my cabin, the trees, the creek, they had endured, and so had I. Stronger, wiser, more certain than ever that standing up for what is right is never wasted, even when the fight seems impossible. Because in the end, it's not about the letters, the fines, or the threats. It's about claiming your life, your peace, and your dignity. And once you do, nothing, not even the most powerful HOA president in the valley, can take it from you.